Welcome, Maggie Burton. And first off, I would like to congratulate you for being awarded the Griffin Trust Canadian First Book Award for your debut, Chores. So congratulations. I'm just going to introduce you briefly, and then I'll look forward to talking about your book. Originally from Brigus, Newfoundland and Labrador, Maggie Burton currently lives in St. John's with her blended family, including 4 young children, a plethora of small animals, and her partner, Michael. Trained as a classical violinist, Maggie is a multidisciplinary performer with a background in arts administration and music education. Maggie started writing poetry after having kids at the age of 20. Currently, she dedicates her time to community-oriented work and writing. Her poems explore family, folklore, feminism, and sexuality. So I'm looking forward to getting into your book a little bit. And the first question I have for you is based on what I've read that has been written about the work so far. It's been written of as reading domestic work, which is traditionally coded as women's work through a feminist lens, though it would seem that that lens is one of choice. In a poem of the book's first half, I Rolled Smokes, the recurring figure of Nan says that gardening doesn't mean I am unemployable, I just prefer it to minimum wage. The young speaker of the book's first half absorbs, figuratively and literally, the product of Nan's work, whether it's food, cigarette smoke, or knowledge. Can you talk a bit about how the work, choice, and women's experience evolves through the book? And if in writing the poems, something revealed itself to you in addition to what you started out with?
Yeah, so on the question of choice, when I was a child, I was pretty confused about why the women in my family were choosing not to work. And, we were very poor, so why wouldn't they just go get a job? That was a question I often asked. And it didn't really make sense to me how they answered it. And that's what I was trying to get at in I Rolled Smokes. But it started to make sense when I had my own children. And I realized, that for them to work a minimum wage job as a cashier at the convenience store meant that after childcare was paid for, there wouldn't be anything left. So it was not really worthwhile for them to go back to work. And I saw that choice was often an illusion in my family, in a rural, depressed economic setting of 1990s Newfoundland. So I was impressed, though, with how rebellious my nans all were and all the women in my family. They'd go to bingo even though their husbands hated it when they did that. So I saw that there was a certain amount of power in deciding how to spend your time. And I wanted to emulate that when I grew up. I always wanted to be like my nans. But in a big way, I think writing these poems helped me understand their motivations. And then when I was 19, I made the choice to keep a baby when I got pregnant. And then I had to face the consequences of that decision to become a mother so young. And I turned to poetry to help process all the complex feelings I had about it. So that's where, my relationship to the concept of choice and to women's work really changed throughout the writing of this book.
That's really interesting, and I want to ask you to read a poem in a minute, but just following on from that answer, um, you work also as a counselor for the city of St. John's. Does your work in that arena, I imagine it does invariably influence your writing, but was that work and the writing of the book going on concurrently? And did your work as a counselor inflect the poems?
Yes, it did. So I started writing the poems in this book around 2015, and I became a counselor in 2017. So the timeline of writing it definitely overlapped. And I think that being like a public figure and being a representative of the people of the city, the reason I went into that career is because I was very angry about politics following the 2016 American election. And we had an all-male council, so no women on council at all in the previous iteration of council. So I decided to run and try to shake things up a little. So it definitely puts a fire in my belly in the same way that writing about poetry and about rural Newfoundland does.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you were speaking about choice and a kind of freedom earlier too, and it just sent me back to a long poem in the book about going to bingo and how there's a free square in the center of the bingo card, and the lines of the poem are arranged as though they appear in the squares of the bingo card. But as you page through that poem, as you read through that poem, that word free starts to really jump out of the center of those poems. And that notion of freedom seems very important there and also throughout the book.
Yes.
Can I ask you to read a poem, please?
Yeah, I'll read one about freedom, actually. Let me do that. I'll read I Watch You Beheading, which is about cleaning capelin. So every June in Newfoundland, we go out to the beach and pick up a tub of capelin. And my children think it's disgusting, but it's something that I did as a child. So I continue to do it as a tradition. So this one is called I Watch You Beheading. I hear them singing, rehearsing, lamenting, performing an ode to the freedom of oceans, somehow still resonating, settling in my ears for me to live with. The tendons on the backs of your thumbs startle me as you pop off their heads. I am struck by the quick parallel lines that appear only to recede again under thin skin of hands. Did you catch my eyes? I see myself joining the nautical chorus, all of us warbling together as my head plops on top of their never-closing mouths, voiceless vertebrates in the kitchen sink. I panic. Imagine you pulling up the base of my skeletal self, fingers tugging at it like a piece of knitting, needled so tight it would never fit anyway.
Thank you. There's an endorsement on the back of the book by Mary Dalton, the fabulous Mary Dalton. And she calls you an entirely new voice in Newfoundland poetry, and writes that the book is charged with blood, threat, danger, a sense of the primordial found in Grimm's fairy tales that's interwoven with contemporary girlhood and womanhood. And as children, especially children of a rural and somewhat isolated place, we feel our experience is just the way the world is, just the way things are done. And at what point did you come to see your experience as particular, as rooted in place and in class? And do you feel that childhood in general has sort of a Grimm's fairy tale aspect to it?
Yeah, I definitely feel that childhood has a Grimm's fairy tale overtone. And I see the primal urge to survive, which is inherent in many of the Grimm's fairy tales, as essential for families in rural and isolated places. The stories in my book are often based on tales that my grandparents told me as a child, whether it be the near-death experience of the twin in the bucket in the first story of the book, or in trapping songbirds in March to survive the end of winter, which ends the book. I think in the post-war period in rural Newfoundland, so in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and beyond, after World War I and II, when my grandparents grew up, there was often very few men left in the community, and children and women had to fend for themselves. So I see those experiences as having a lot in common with the world that the Grimm's fairy tales were written about. And yeah, I think that Newfoundland has a very, very interesting history in terms of, rural communities have never known anything but poverty. And it has a lot to do with the blood, threat, and danger, of daily existence.
Yeah, and when when you were writing the book, um, it feels to me that this can happen, and it has happened in my own experience. But do you feel that in writing the poems that some aspects came to the fore or changed in ways that perhaps you didn't expect when you were starting out?
Yeah. So one of the things that I was trying to do, I think, when I wrote it was to process my own childhood, which was very traumatic in a lot of ways. And I started out as feeling like maybe it was all bad, that there was nothing really good. And I ended the process of writing it by seeing a lot more beauty and just complexity in the experience. So I think for me, the main things that came out of the forefront that really changed over the writing of it was my own internal experience of my childhood and of rural Newfoundland and of all of the women before me, um, and my place in that sort of world.
Mm-hmm. Well, complexity is an interesting word because the language of the book is very plain spoken, but there is intense complexity to it, and I want to return to that in a bit. The book is divided into two halves. The first, rooted in childhood and anchored by the figure of Nan, who you say in the notes to the book is sort of an amalgam of women, and not necessarily the autobiographical Nan. And the second half of the book is more grounded in your experience as an adult, making a home. Did you write the second half of the book after you had gone through the first, or were they concurrent?
Yeah, the first poem I wrote in this collection was Chores, and I really stuck with that theme as I went on. And I started by writing, what I knew. So I knew my childhood, I knew how I felt about it all. I had a lot to say. And then as I got to know myself a little bit better, and as I got older, because I wrote this over about a 10-year period, I started to write more about my own experience as an adult as opposed to as a child. And I think because I've had processed some of my childhood in the writing of it, I was ready to look at my sort of real-time experiences a little bit more kindly as well.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Well, there feels to me to be a shift in terms of the imagery from the first to the second half, in that the childhood speaker is their experience is very much, the violence and the threat and the blood is very much embedded in the experience. It is the way things happen. And in the second half, it feels as though the violence and the threats and all of that which is embedded in experience in general, it feels to me to be of a slightly different variety. The speaker is you know, slips on floors, breaks things. There's the smell of bleach that sickens them, and it feels as though maybe those sorts of that danger is coming from without a little bit more, rather than sort of generated from internal experience. And I'm wondering if that's how it felt to you, or if you feel that is a shift in the book.
For sure, yeah. I think the speaker throughout the book, I think she fights against the impulse to accept her fate, whether it be the internal sort of struggle that she's going through or the external world of doing chores. She doesn't want to accept a fate similar to her ancestors. She thinks somehow that she's above that, maybe that she was destined to have a slightly different type of life, as opposed to doing nothing but domestic work, which is what she saw growing up. And I think that implicit in the later poems is also a resentment of the gendered expectations of her relationships. So she's expected to clean up after the mess is left by others, like her ex-boyfriend leaves pickled wieners in the fridge and she has to clean them up. But gradually, I think she tries to make the work something of beauty so she can accept it and find ways of approaching doing that work with a sense of humor. And sometimes she even finds joy or peace in fleeting moments, but also the danger is still there. It just comes from a different place for sure. And yeah, I think the speaker tries to remember where she came from as a way to draw strength in order to get through the present.
Right, yeah. Well, there's the poem about waiting at the hole where the mice are coming in. And, at the same time, needing to trap them, but also thinking that it's a kind of, there's a sort of magic to her imagining of these little creatures in the walls, and it's kind of a return to childhood. The and there's a very interesting defamiliarization of domestic work as well. It's mundane, it's rote, but it's also, profoundly weird, going to the through the freezer and digging through the remnants of forgotten things that were put there for a reason, but that now, in their current state have become something completely other. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of, things that are contained, like the vacuum cleaner bag, all coming out, and jars breaking all over the floor, and all of that. So there's a very interesting defamiliarization going on with all of that work as well, all of the inside coming out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, back to the complexity. You have your experience includes many different things, and I'm always interested in work that refuses to establish a hierarchy of influences, separating things into, the high and the low.
Yeah.
The book contains references to visual arts, music, opera, John Wayne movies, bingo, details of place, local radio. Can you speak a little bit about your influences and how they come together to inform the work?
For sure. I think I was very lucky to grow up in a really rich culture of rural Newfoundland. It was by far the best element of my upbringing. We were always been a family of creatives, and everybody had a craft that they practiced. Everybody had art that they admired. It was always talked about. It was always done. It was sort of went without saying that you always found a way to keep your hands busy. So, my mother and my grandfather are oil painters. My pop built violins, guitars, mandolins. He built instruments, and every single person that I knew growing up was a musician. You just played music. It was just something you did. Um, so I grew up on country music and BOWR, which is a local radio station here. And I became interested in classical music when I was a teenager, but I did so to make it sort of my thing, that made me stand apart from my family. So I went to music school, became a violinist, and I never considered it better than the music that I grew up with. I just considered it as equal, but it was mine. No one else in my family plays classical music except for me. So yeah, I think my tendency is to smush it all together into just art that I like or art that I don't like.
Yeah. Or do you still play?
Oh yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah, yeah. Well, it's the idea of a rural or somewhat isolated, or a background that that is not um, conventionally aligned with the intellectual per se, is
Yeah.
something that is, I mean, it's a division that's not true, is it?
No.
That only certain people can be intellectuals if they come from a certain place or a certain class or have certain experiences.
Right. Yeah. No, everybody in my family was very intelligent, and I was blessed to have really complicated discussions all the time with them. So
Yeah, that's great. There are many rituals in the book, and I want to, my last question is about ritual. Certainly the cigarette in the first half of the book, Nan's cigarettes, they permeate that section. You can almost smell the cigarette smoke. And I wanted to ask you, if the ritual aspect of chores, of what you experienced in childhood, if that idea of ritual continues to be important to you.
while I was writing the book, I was really interested in the shame that comes along with certain rituals and certain sort of components of a practice of keeping house. So smoking and drinking was just something that everybody did. Gambling, these rituals anchor us in our daily life, but some of them are more taboo than others. And as a child, I was very judgmental of the smoking and the drinking and the gambling. But as an adult, I've sort of learned to not do that and to look at everything as just being the way that we get through our life. You have to cling to whatever rituals you can in order to face the randomness and chaos of daily life, especially with children and domestic tasks to get through. So I think like whether it's through prayer or meditation or having a smoke with a morning coffee, everybody has a ritual that they engage with that helps them get through the day.
Thanks so much. Maybe we'll end with another poem.
Sure. I think I'll read Cleaning Out the Fridge. And this was based on an experience I had when I accidentally broke a jar and found glass around my kitchen for months afterwards. Thank you so much for the interview, Karen. It was a pleasure to talk.
You likewise.
Shelves weighed down with unnecessary bits of lives sustained by convenience, stored turkey, dressing, and gravy sandwiches. Packets of tartar sauce resting in vegetable drawers, drowning in old cucumber juice. You are saucy enough, I hear Nan say, fishing them out. Ancient jars of pickled wieners from a time when my ex was trying new things, and I told him I would soon say, I told you so. My mouth puckers into a shape I remember from when flippers were cooked. The grossness of this Saturday chore, too much for me. The jar whips out of my hand, breaks everything. I don't sweep it up. Glass will probably settle in my feet, in pieces too small to feel it anyway.
Thank you, Maggie, and congratulations again.